What is Juneteenth? By Muddy Water.
1979.
Okay. Well, Juneteenth was officially declared in Texas by legislation in 1979, where every U.S. state would recognize the holiday of Juneteenth for the freedom of slaves of June 19th, 1865. However, the real meaning of Juneteenth is the freedom of certain slaves in Galveston, Texas, while the rest of America was already freed from slavery and servitude. So the people in Galveston didn't catch wind to it, while the rest of America was already navigating in their freedoms, so to speak. So Major General Gordon Granger, on June 19, 1865, he proclaimed freedom for slaves in Texas, mainly Galveston, Texas. Galveston, Texas is real important because that was a major import and export area. I guess that would be Midwest or the West. It was also called, Galveston also was called the Wall Street of the South. That's how big the import and export was there prior to the flood that they had in 1900. But when you come to importing, exporting and of goods, Galveston was probably one of the top three largest outside of Charleston, South Carolina, New York, and then you got Galveston. And the people that were freed in Galveston wasn't just quote unquote slaves or quote unquote African Americans. They were actually the Karankawa Indians in Galveston. Like I said, it was a big major import and export, and the Karankawa Indians down there were the actual slaves that were there. So that is what Juneteenth really represents. It does not represent every black man and woman in America. It is for those black men and women, aka Karankawa Indians in Galveston, Texas, who got their freedom in 1865 because Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. So everyone wants to think every black man and woman were freed 1865. Nope, that was 1863, and these people were still working their low minimum wages or free labor during that time. And there was also a lot of black people who were been freed or wasn't slaves at all during this time. Celebrating slavery actually being abolished is there's not a one answer to that, because everyone that is black in America wasn't even slaves. So that would go to talking to your families to see if y'all even had slaves in your family, whether indentured servants or served as chattel slaves, because everyone wasn't even a slave. The slavery narrative is big business for many large companies in America. And Juneteenth fits right along with the narrative of we've been captive for 400 years on a strange land that is not our own. So Juneteenth is the cherry on top, so to speak, of the whole slavery narrative. It marks a symbol of freedom for black people, which in actuality, that's not even the case. It's for Galveston. The people in Galveston, they turn up every year for this because they know that their ancestors went through this. But every black man in America and women in America did not go through this at all. If you're not from Galveston, this really has nothing to do with you. So a lot of our famous scholars that our community looks up to, that work for these big corporations or have sponsorship by these big corporations. Some of these shows even teach our children ABCs and 1, 2, 3s. They push this narrative because they also push the slave narrative. So the end of slavery, it's the same people pushing it. And it's also a big bag. A lot of money is spent on Juneteenth because it's good for quote unquote black people because that's a day they could capitalize on selling their products or whatever. But
they are.
But the downside is you selling it on a false pretense, kind of like the Black Friday holiday in November. It's the same context to me.
Because that's also new.
Yes, Black Friday is also new. But with Juneteenth, everyone wants to show sympathy for black people and like, oh, I'll go support their business for today. The same as the Black Wall Street narrative. Everyone in today's time wants to be the next Black Wall Street, but and I respect how they're doing it, but people don't know the real stories behind it. So you'll take a day, make your little money for that day, and that's it. But it's no longevity in it. If you're not making $100,000 in that one day, then what's the point of just taking this one day to promote yourself or get the product out? Because outside of that day, outside of the marketing for that day, if you're not a good business person, how is you going to get your product off? They don't really only buying it for the sympathy of, oh, your ancestors were slave. Outside that day, they don't give a fuck. They feel like they're doing their good deed for the community, whether they feel like their ancestor allegedly owned someone or not. Black Lives Matter, that's been a new thing for the last 4 or 5 years. So they want to show that Black Lives Matter, they're going to put their money to your business for that day. Like, I did a good deed. I spent money, then they're going to go to church Sunday and feel good about themselves because they supported black business or black businesses for federal days that the government assigned as a holiday for freed slaves. So that's, in a nutshell, why they're doing that. Because they probably don't even know the actual meaning neither. I would say both parties that are in the same social status or economic status. It doesn't matter the color on this end because the people pulling the strings are both white and black, or quote unquote white and black. So white people they catching the short end of the stick also because of the lack of knowledge, the same as the black man or woman are catching the short end of the stick on this particular subject matter about owning slaves and being a slave. Because the flip side would be, if people really did their research, it was more of those white people being slaves in America than these so-called black people. Not just in Galveston, all over the South and Midwest, and even up north. The companies that's paying the billions of dollars to push this every year.
So are they aware of what's really going on?
Of course, they are definitely aware. Because you see it on your commercials and your TV when we getting close to the holiday, they're the ones spending the marketing dollars for it. They're telling a joke with facts in it and capitalizing. They playing every side of it.
So they're aware?
Of course, very aware.
So they're the only parties that support it?
Well, a brother like myself is aware too, but I'm just not capitalizing off of it. I know what's going on too. I would say, regarding Juneteenth, many black people heard of it, but didn't, until maybe the last 5 years, really embrace it. But I would say black people always heard about it. It was like, oh, okay, Juneteenth, we was free from slavery. But it wasn't federally recognized until Joe Biden made it a federal holiday, which was 2021. So up until then, we heard about it. It just wasn't, you couldn't call out of work for it. Like now, people could call out of work for Martin Luther King's birthday. Juneteenth is like that today. You could call out, but really, again, the slavery narrative keeps wealth into the hands that they are in. So when people understand who is who during this time of slavery, who was the slave, who wasn't the slave, what is a slave, all of those things about that slavery narrative is all twisted and flipped upside down and sideways. It's definitely dictated because I mentioned earlier that everyone wasn't a slave that has melanin on their skin in America. That might be new to a lot of people that has melanin on their skin and don't. So just from that perspective, they don't want everybody to know that because that is the real narrative of all us Americans, even the people who came from another country and became American. We were all taught the same thing. So if everyone knew the real knowledge and knew that slavery was not what was taught to us, that would mess up a lot of old wealth in America. The community members are pushing it based off the knowledge that they're given. Also, what we have to understand, you have to get approval to push things within the means of
Holidays and such.
within the means of, well, you don't want to step outside the means where you get red flag. So what I'm saying would not be on your local Juneteenth event outside of Galveston, Texas. In Galveston, y'all gonna hear, oh, the freedom of slaves in Galveston, particularly Indians that were slaves, that look like black people because those are the Indians and the slave. Those are the same people, one and the same. I mean, it happened in their city. I mean, that's probably an age-old story they've been hearing from generation to generation. That's easy to maintain something when it happened in your neck of the woods. But when you got people from all over the country, they just get in the narrative. So if we were in Galveston, we would see festivals as big as probably the Thanksgiving festival or the Christmas festival, how they have parades and things. In Galveston, there's a big thing there. And I respect that because that happened there. But for the rest of the country to embrace it as that was for all people is just a lie that they capitalizing off. Texas is called the Lone Star State for a reason. They do what the fuck they want to do. Yes, they are part of America. It's one of the 50 states. But Texas, they say everything done big is done in Texas. They kind of go against the grain. Even their government entities don't do what the rest of the country do.
They always threaten to secede.
Right. Texas has always been like that. So even though Texas has their celebration, it's a day of marketing, sales, all of these things that big companies could take advantage of for Juneteenth, which is money for the U.S. economy.
Right.
So, in a nutshell, money talks. You know, if, yes, that happened in Galveston, but if the whole country can make money off of that one weekend, why not? Same as Black Friday. So many sales that people think are sales happen on Black Friday. It's the same thing when you have a Memorial Day sale, a Labor Day sale. Now we starting to see Juneteenth sales. It's the same concept. It's about generating money. That's for today's time. That's in a nutshell why the whole government wants to take part of it. On top of pushing their slavery narrative, which is money in that too. One thing we gotta understand, I said in the earlier point, Galveston was one of the biggest places because it's at the bottom of Texas. It's near the ocean. So it's huge on import and export. What we forgot to mention, well, I don't want to say forgot to mention, what wasn't mentioned is that somebody had to control that water and that land there. So when we dealing with slavery, we always know the term plantation. You know, plantation is basically farms. And people controlled those farms and they were not white people. So the Union and the Confederate, the reason why they even fighting, going back and forth is because the people in the South who had the slaves were fighting the Union because the Union was trying to take these landowners' land. Those landowners were black people, or Negroes, or Indians, whatever term you want to adhere to. Those landowners were the original Americans of the land, and they were black people. So when these Union. The Union stands for United States Army. It is not a branch of the United States Army. It is the Army. So, for lack of better words, it is the U.S. Army fighting Southern entrepreneurs on trying to encroach on their land, take their wealth from them. So that's why you're always hearing the Confederacy versus the Union. And the Confederacy is always painted as the bad people, and the Union is the knight in shining armor coming to save everybody. When in actuality, the Union are the bad people, because that is the U.S. Army. That's what they would wind up being called later, to come fight the landowners of the South, to take their wealth from them. And those slaves that people were taught were slaves were not even slaves. A lot of them were just family members working the land. There were slaves on there. Sometimes you would have immigrants come in and work, but the South were suffering from the Union because they were losing their wealth, so they had to literally fight to maintain their money. You got a bunch of farmers who are fighting, but there were also militia districts who would help maintain the commodities in the area. So when the Union is coming down to fight in the South, it is like a good versus evil type thing. And the Union was always taught that they were the good guys and they were actually the bad guys. Because the narrative behind this story is those plantation owners were never the face of the black man and woman, and they actually were. And when you hear plantation, we have the connotation of slavery, Kunta Kinte roots type thing. It just simply means farmer. So it's a bunch of wealth in the southern lands, all of the gold and all of the minerals and commodities and rubies that come out of the South. The Union, or the U.S. Army, for better words, because that's who they were trying to take the wealth of the people in the South. So that's why you always hear the Union coming to fight the Confederates and all that. But the Confederates were black people. A bunch of black people who are living in these lands come joining together to try to maintain their shit. That is what the Confederacy was, in spite of you seeing. Right, exactly. In spite of the meaning of that Confederate flag you guys see, that was a black, that's black, those are black people flag. That's a black flag. Shout out to my ancestors who had that flag, the Chickamauga Cherokee, that's that flag. So yes, today is a different connotation to it, just like the holiday that we're talking about now. It's a different connotation to what the foundation of it is. So what we gotta understand is when it comes to Galveston, those people in Galveston, yeah, they got slaved they got freed, but a lot of those people were enslaved on their own land. There's a term called domestic slave trade. Domestic means in-house. So you're not getting no outsiders from other parts of the world to come in as being a slave. You're dealing with the people already on the land. And Galveston was at war. They were fighting all his immigrants coming in, and you got the Union, aka the U.S. Army, coming in because that is the Wall Street of the South. That is literally what Galveston was called at one point. So if you got a bunch of Negroes controlling a place called Wall Street of the South, best and believe you're going to have the government and everybody else at your neck to try to take that. So we have casualties in war, right? People die, and then you also have people who become prisoners of war. These people in Galveston wasn't no wimpy people. They were prisoners of war who got enslaved on their own land. It's called domestic slave trade. That is a term we do not hear about in the whole 400-year slavery story. And we talking about Juneteenth being a freedom of that, of Africans coming over as slaves. Why we don't hear about domestic slave trade? Domestic means in-house. You don't deal with nobody outside of that. So when we say in-house, that means inland or in the country. Because we also have to understand in this Juneteenth thing, since we're talking about slavery, there was an act passed. It was the 1804 Act of the Prohibition of Slavery, where no foreign ships, any ships, no ships at all could bring in slaves because it was a federal crime. That is what the government passed, 1807. Now, this holiday deals with 1865. So we talking 50 plus years of the slave trade going on that was not happening because that's a federal crime. There were no ships coming in, bringing in people from Africa because you were going to be charged federally. All right. So when we understand that, what didn't be affected was the domestic slave trade. So domestic slave trade is, okay, we ain't got to bring in slaves from Africa and other places. We're going to enslave who's already here. All melanated people in America, North America, we are not all brothers and sisters. Just because we have the same skin tone and similar hair textures, we are not all brothers and sisters. I know that's been preached for years about black unity and all these terms that sound nice, but that is false. We are not all brothers and sisters. Everybody does not come from the same tribes, same families. So shout out to the people in Galveston. But I'm somebody who's speaking, and I'm going to speak for me. I've done my family research, and on my mother and father's side, I only found one quote-unquote slave, and it was not even chattel slavery. It was a partnership for like 10 years that my ancestor had to work for some land because they were in too much debt for the land that they had. So it was kind of like sharecropping, but this was before the sharecropping term came out. So they had to pay off some debt because their land got wiped out in a hurricane. So they worked with somebody else for 10 years, including her children. They also worked for this person. Like when you sign up for a job, you have an agreement, whether you retire there or whatever the case is, to work to pay off what you need to pay, and that's it. So that is the story for many people in America. We did not come off no boats, and if somebody was a slave, quote unquote, look up to see what they were doing, because slave just mean employee. So we are not all brothers and sisters. We don't come from the same families. That whole Mother Africa thing, that is not true. As far as my Negroes here in America, this is our motherland, but we still not brothers and sisters. We might be some cousins and stuff like that. It's up to you to really research your family and see what people you come from. So if you are a Brown, your last name is Brown, and you have the Brown family, and then you know how it would be like, oh, I could tell they are Brown. Look at their nose. Look how they talk. Little things that we do in our community, you can tell that's your family. You can say, that's my kinfolk. Stop using that term as a general thing because we all black. Because just because we all black, we not the same. Because even some of those slave traders that we are talking about, including in Galveston, was a black man that was selling and moving a lot of slaves in and out of Galveston and enslaving some of the people in Galveston, them Karankawa Indians. He was a black Jewish pirate making a lot of money down there. He was just one of many, but that's what I mean. Everybody's not brother and sister because we skin color. Nobody else do that but black people. I don't hear Asians do it. A Chinese will not say they brothers to Japanese. White people don't do that. Nobody else, Latinos don't do that. A Mexican do not say a Puerto Rican is their brother. Let alone a Puerto Rican and Dominican. You call a Puerto Rican and Dominican, it's off at your head. They don't like that. Only black people do that. We are not all brothers and sisters unless you know for a fact y'all come from the same tribe, and tribe means family.
So why was it such a big occasion? Like the whole abolishment, or even in Galveston terms, Juneteenth is when we got freedom. What does freedom mean? Freedom from what? Is it just like work, like unions have beefs with their companies and shit? Or it's a labor situation? Or
so
what's really going on when they say free from?
So you said labor situation. That's a great point to say, because that's exactly what it was. These people were getting paid. That's another thing people don't learn. in the slavery narrative. It was unfair wages, not necessarily free wage. They just had a employee to employer disagreement. So when everyone else be in Civil War time, so the South is kind of losing its grip on maintaining their land because you got tons of immigrants coming in through Galveston, as well as Ellis Island in New York. A lot of Jewish immigrants. So with these Jewish immigrants coming in, many stayed in New York, but they was also told, oh, y'all could come in through Galveston too and get jobs, land, different situations like that. So the original landowners are losing its grip. So when the Emancipation Proclamation was signed by Abraham Lincoln, it didn't have nothing to do with freeing no slaves, because Lincoln was actually a slave as a kid, is what they don't teach neither. He was an actual slave. His father sold him to another man, and he had to work for him for 7 to 15 years. Lincoln was a slave himself. He was also not white. Lincoln was described as a tall, skinny, swarthy man. Swarthy means dark skin. So that might be for a later time. But just know, and Lincoln is also on the copper penny. So the joke is, oh, Lincoln freed the slaves and he got killed for it. Lincoln was a slave. And even him being a slave, it wasn't for slavery. It was the disagreement between the South and New York. They wanted to tax these people in the South for some shit that's theirs that ain't got nothing to do with the government. Remember, the Union is the U.S. Army. These people in the South, they are sovereign people. They are their government. They even had kingdoms here. So they like, fuck what y'all trying to do. This our shit. That's why the fighting is happening. They're trying to tax the Southerners for their own shit that they produce. It's not like the Union is providing these commodities for them. This is their shit, and y'all want to tax me? Nah, that's not how that works. So it was bloodshed for that. So when Lincoln signed the paperwork, Emancipation Proclamation, we were taught that was for freedom of African American slaves, where it had shit to do with slavery. It was taxing on the commodities of the South. And the original landowners of the South, they had to deal with the taxing, the death that they were going through, the wars that they were fighting here on their own land to maintain some shit they didn't have for thousands and thousands of years. And what we have to understand about Confederacy and Union, there's nations that are allied with both parties. So the Confederates, as we may know, they had Britain. So if I said earlier that the original landowners were niggas, Negroes, Indians, they had ties to foreign nations like Britain to help fight the Union, who had ties to like France and different other places like that. So it should hopefully give you some sense of thought was, okay, if this guy who I don't know is telling me that the original owners of the South were black people, and then they had allies like Britain, that should show you the power of the black people of the land dealing with foreign entities, and why other foreign nations would want to come take their things, because the South didn't just float the economy in America. We fed many nations all over the world, especially like with our corn and our tobacco and the gold. I mean, we could list a ton of things that came out. But the point is, Emancipation Proclamation was not to end slavery, because slavery, chattel slavery, wasn't even as big as they telling us it is, like how they tell us on Juneteenth. You have more prisoners of war and indentured servants. The chattel slavers would be the people that's popping up at y'all Juneteenth table. Shout out to y'all. Y'all get y'all bag. But those other people that don't look like you, that's coming and want to pay their sympathy and spend their money with you, those would be the ones who went through chattel slavery during this time in America.
What you mean, like Europeans?
Not even Europeans, because some of those slavers that I mentioned were Europeans, but they were black.
Right.
Shout out to the Moors. Y'all. Well, back then they would be called Sephardic. One example would be Jean Lafitte. He was a Jewish slave trader in Galveston. He made a lot of money, but he was Sephardic. Sephardic means black, and but he was a Jew.
No, white.
But he was from Europe.
I'm saying, what do you call that? We can't even call him European.
You can't call him European if we want to be smart. We can't if we want to take the little.
What do we call him?
I mean,
What do you call him?
I say 2% people or other people. Because you can't even say European because the original Europeans was black too. Even during this time, a lot of those immigrants coming over were also black people.
So what are you, 2%?
Like 2% milk.
Without all the fat shit. Without all the substance. Take out all the substance and that's
Shout out to my niece. I got that one from my niece. When she hear it, she'll know. So Juneteenth is a day that my fellow black Americans celebrate on a whole complete lie. So if y'all gonna do it, do it. But at least make a year's salary in the weekend that you're doing it. Because to me, it's not worth a couple of dollars. If they're gonna capitalize off it, and you can say fuck what I'm saying, that's cool. But get your bag though. Let that bag change some bills for the next few months at least. If you at least you capitalize off it. I'm never stopping nobody from getting a bag. But now you know better. When you know better, you're supposed to do better. Because now you done heard my voice.